Please, I don't want to eat that, Mrs. Grace Chen whispered, her voice shaking like a leaf in the wind. But Victoria Sterling, her son's wife, pushed the plate of spoiled leftovers closer to the old woman's trembling hands. The food smelled bad, really bad, like it had been sitting in the hot sun for days. "You'll eat what I give you or you won't eat at all," Victoria hissed, her pretty face twisted into something ugly. Mrs. Grace looked at the moldy rice and greasy meat on the plate. Her stomach felt sick just looking at it. How did things get so bad? How did her own home become a prison? Let me tell you how it all started. 3 months ago, Mrs. Grace Chen was the happiest mother in the world. Her son David had finally found love. At 75 years old, she had been waiting and waiting for him to bring home a wife. For years, she had lived alone in their big mansion, cleaning and cooking, hoping for the day when she would have a daughter to love. When David brought Victoria home, Mrs. Grace thought her prayers had been answered. Victoria was beautiful. She had long black hair that shined like silk, and she always wore pretty red dresses that made her look like a movie star. She had a sweet smile and spoke in a soft, gentle voice that made everyone feel warm inside. "Hello, Mama," Victoria had said on their first meeting, taking Mrs. Grace's wrinkled hands in her smooth ones. "I've heard so many wonderful things about you. I hope we can be best friends." Mrs. Grace had cried happy tears that day. Finally, she wouldn't be alone anymore. The first 3 weeks were like living in a fairy tale. Victoria would help Mrs. Grace walk to the dinner table when her old legs felt wobbly. She would bring her hot soup when she felt cold. She would sit beside her and listen to stories about David when he was a little boy. "Tell me more about when David was 7, Victoria would say with sparkling eyes. "I want to know everything about my husband's childhood." Mrs. Grace would light up like a Christmas tree and share story after story. Victoria would laugh at all the right parts and gasp when little David got into trouble. She would even call Mrs. Grace Mama, just like a real daughter would. At night, Mrs. Grace would whisper prayers of thanks. "Thank you, God, for bringing me such a wonderful daughter-in-law," she would say. "My lonely days are over." She even called her old friend Mrs. Johnson on the phone to brag. "Oh, you should see her. Victoria is so kind and respectful. She treats me like I'm her own mother. David chose perfectly." But masks don't stay on forever, and Victoria's mask was starting to slip. It began with tiny things that Mrs. Grace almost didn't notice. Victoria stopped bringing her fresh, hot meals. Instead, David would get a big, steaming plate full of delicious food. Victoria would serve herself a smaller but still good portion. And Mrs. Grace? She got the leftovers. Cold rice that had been sitting out for hours. Bread crusts that were hard as rocks. Soup that had a film on top because it was so old. At first, Mrs. Grace thought it was just a mistake. Maybe Victoria forgot, she told herself. Maybe the cook was busy. But then Victoria started saying mean things. "You don't need so much food at your age," Victoria said one evening, sliding a half-empty plate toward Mrs. Grace. "Your body doesn't work the same anymore. Why waste good meat on you?" Mrs. Grace's heart felt like someone had squeezed it tight, but she stayed quiet. She didn't want to cause trouble. When Mrs. Grace asked for hot tea one cold morning, Victoria just smirked. That's when someone smiles in a nasty way. "Hot tea isn't good for your old teeth," Victoria said with a laugh. "I'll bring you whatever's left later. Maybe." The smirks grew into mean stares. The words became sharper, like knives cutting into Mrs. Grace's heart. By the second month, Mrs. Grace saw the real Victoria. Whenever David left for work, the sweet daughter-in-law would disappear completely. In her place stood a woman with cold eyes and a cruel mouth. "You think you're a queen in this house?" Victoria snapped one morning when Mrs. Grace reached for fresh fruit from the bowl. Slap! Victoria hit Mrs. Grace's hand away from the fruit bowl. The old woman gasped in shock and pain. "This isn't your house anymore," Victoria said, her voice as cold as ice. "It's mine. Don't touch what doesn't belong to you, old woman." Mrs. Grace's heart broke into 1,000 pieces. She had lived in this house for 40 years. She had raised David here, cooked meals here, laughed and cried here. Now this stranger was telling her she didn't belong. From that day on, the cruelty got worse and worse. Victoria would slam plates down so hard they rattled like angry thunder. She would call Mrs. Grace lazy, spoiled, and a burden. When the old woman tried to sit quietly with her hands folded, trying to keep her dignity, Victoria would mock her. "Look at her," Victoria would say loudly so the servants could hear, acting like some saint when she's nothing but a shadow sucking the air from this house. At night, Mrs. Grace would cry into her pillow. She would whisper apologies to her dead husband. "I'm sorry, my love," she would say. "I don't know how to protect myself anymore." She kept waiting for David to notice, but he worked late every day and traveled often for business. He was blind to what was happening under his own roof. Yesterday was the worst day of all. David was having a big party for his business friends. The mansion was full of important people, politicians, rich businessmen, and neighbors. The dining room overflowed with delicious food. There were plates of rice that smelled like heaven, roasted chicken that made everyone's mouth water, and desserts that looked like works of art. Victoria stood in the center of it all, her hand on David's arm, smiling her fake smile. To everyone watching, she looked like the perfect wife. But Mrs. Grace saw her daughter-in-law's eyes darting around the room, cold and calculating like a snake. This morning, when all the guests had gone home and the servants had cleaned up, Mrs. Grace shuffled into the kitchen. She was tired and hungry. All she wanted was to make a simple bowl of rice porridge, something warm and gentle for her old stomach. But before she could even reach for the rice jar, she heard the sharp click, click, click of high heels on the kitchen tiles. Victoria appeared like a storm cloud, her arms crossed and her eyes flashing with anger. "Porridge?" she mocked, looking at Mrs. Grace like she was something disgusting. "Why bother cooking? There's plenty of food right here." She pointed at the pile of leftover food from the party. But this wasn't fresh food anymore. It was spoiled, greasy, and covered with flies. The meat was hard and cold. The rice had turned into lumps. Everything smelled terrible. Mrs. Grace stepped back. "That food is spoiled," she said quietly. "It's not safe to eat." Victoria's laugh was like breaking glass. "Not safe for me, maybe, but perfect for you. Why should we waste it?" She grabbed a dirty plate and scooped up a heap of the disgusting leftovers. She set it down in front of Mrs. Grace with a loud bang. The smell made Mrs. Grace feel sick. Her lips began to tremble. "Please don't make me eat that." Victoria leaned down close, her voice becoming a whisper that sounded like a snake. "You'll eat what I give you, or you won't eat at all." Tears filled Mrs. Grace's old eyes. "I raised a son in this house. I am his mother. You cannot treat me like this." Victoria threw back her head and laughed. "Mother? That title doesn't mean anything here. You're nothing but dead weight, old woman. And if you're too proud for this food, maybe you don't deserve any food at all." Mrs. Grace tried to stand up, but her old knees gave out. She fell back down, and the plate of spoiled food spilled all over her clean blouse. She began to sob, clutching her chest as her heart felt like it was breaking. "You're pathetic," Victoria spat. And that's when she did something so cruel, so terrible, that it would change everything forever. Victoria grabbed a handful of the cold, moldy rice in her perfectly manicured fingers. She moved toward Mrs. Grace like a predator hunting its prey. "Open your mouth," she commanded. "Eat it now. Eat every last scrap. You have no choice." Mrs. Grace pressed her lips together tight, shaking her head desperately. "Please don't," she begged. "I'm begging you." But Victoria only smiled that cruel smile, forcing the disgusting food closer to the old woman's mouth. Her voice rose into a wicked shout that echoed through the kitchen. "You will eat this, old woman. You will eat every bite until I say stop." Mrs. Grace kept her lips sealed shut, tears rolling down her cheeks like rivers of sadness. The younger woman pressed the clump of spoiled food harder toward her mouth. The kitchen air was heavy with the smell of rotten leftovers and pure cruelty. And then, they both heard something that made them freeze like statues. The sound of footsteps. Sharp, quick footsteps on the marble floor, getting closer and closer. Someone was coming to the kitchen. Someone who wasn't supposed to be home yet. Someone who was about to see everything. Victoria's hand froze in the air, still holding the clump of spoiled rice near Mrs. Grace's trembling lips. The old woman stopped crying and listened carefully. Those footsteps sounded familiar. Very familiar. Click, click, click. Heavy shoes on marble. Getting closer to the kitchen, but it couldn't be. David wasn't supposed to come home until tomorrow night. Victoria's face turned white as a ghost. She dropped the disgusting food and quickly wiped her hands on a kitchen towel. "Get up," she whispered harshly to Mrs. Grace. "Get up right now and clean yourself." But it was too late. A tall figure appeared in the kitchen doorway. He wore a blue business suit and carried a black suitcase. His tie was loose around his neck like he had been traveling for hours. It was David Chen, and he was home early. His eyes moved slowly around the kitchen. First, he saw his mother sitting on the floor, her blouse stained with greasy food and tears streaming down her face. Then he saw his wife standing over her, curry still smeared on her fingers, her face twisted with anger and panic. For a moment that felt like forever, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The silence was so thick you could cut it with a knife. David's chest began to rise and fall quickly. His hands clenched into fists. His face grew darker and darker as he understood what he was seeing. "Mother." The word exploded from his mouth like thunder. He dropped his suitcase with a loud crash and rushed to Mrs. Grace. He fell to his knees beside her on the cold kitchen floor and gently lifted her frail body into his strong arms. "What happened?" he asked, his voice cracking like he was about to cry. "Who did this to you?" He used his suit sleeve to wipe the tears from her face, being as gentle as if she were made of delicate glass. Mrs. Grace looked up at her son's worried face. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She was too shocked, too hurt, too scared to explain. But she didn't need to say anything. The truth was screaming through the air for anyone to see. David turned his head slowly toward Victoria. She was backing away from them, trying to hide behind the kitchen counter. Her red dress looked bright against her pale, frightened face. "You," David whispered, and that single word carried more anger than a hurricane carries wind. Then something happened that nobody expected. David's hand flew through the air faster than lightning. Slap! The sound cracked through the kitchen like a gunshot. Victoria stumbled backward, clutching her cheek, her eyes wide with shock and disbelief. "How dare you hit me?" she shrieked, her voice high and shrill like a screaming bird. "You hit me in front of her!" David stood up slowly, still holding his mother protectively in his arms. His eyes burned like fire. "I should have done it the first time you disrespected her." He helped Mrs. Grace to her feet and pulled her close to his chest, shielding her like a wall between her and Victoria. "You think I didn't see?" His voice got louder with each word. "I saw everything, every tear you caused, every cruel word, every time you made her feel worthless in her own home." Victoria's hand was still pressed to her red cheek. "She's lying," she shouted desperately. "I never hurt her. I've been nothing but kind." "Don't!" David roared so loudly that the pots and pans seemed to shake. "Don't you dare twist the truth. I came home early to surprise you, and instead I find this." He pointed at the mess on the floor, the spilled food, the dirty plates, the evidence of cruelty everywhere. "My mother was on the ground like an animal while you tried to force her to eat garbage." Victoria's voice started to shake, but she tried to sound angry instead of scared. "You can't talk to me like this. I'm your wife. You married me. You need me." David stepped forward, and Victoria stepped back. "Need you?" He laughed, but it wasn't a happy laugh. It was cold and bitter. "The only thing I need is for you to get out of this house. You can't throw me out." Victoria's voice cracked like thin ice. "If you make me leave, I'll file for alimony. I'll take you to court. You'll have to pay me money every single month for the rest of your life." Mrs. Grace gasped. Even in her pain, she was worried about her son. Victoria was threatening to take his money, to hurt him through the legal system. But David just smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of someone who wasn't afraid anymore. "File it," he said calmly, pointing his finger directly at Victoria's face. "Go ahead, do it. Take me to court." He took another step forward, and Victoria pressed herself against the kitchen wall like she was trying to disappear into it. But remember this, Victoria Sterling, he continued, his voice getting stronger with every word. You've been cruel to my mother. You've hurt and humiliated the woman who raised me. David gestured around the kitchen, then toward the rest of the house. These walls have ears. Every servant in this house has seen your true face. Every neighbor has heard you screaming. The security cameras have recorded your cruelty. Victoria's eyes grew wide. She had forgotten about the cameras. David had installed them everywhere after some expensive art had been stolen from a neighbor's house. You think the law will protect you? David continued. You think a judge will give you money after they see how you treated an innocent old woman? The truth will bury you so deep you'll never crawl out. For the first time since the wedding, Victoria looked truly scared. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. She couldn't think of anything to say. But Victoria Sterling was not the type of person to give up easily. Pride and stubbornness forced her to lift her chin and try one last time. We'll see about that, she said, trying to make her voice sound strong and confident. We'll just see what happens in court. David nodded slowly. Yes, we will see. The next few weeks passed like a terrible storm. Victoria hired the most expensive lawyer she could find, a man in a shiny suit who promised he could get her lots of money from David. Don't worry, the lawyer told her in his fancy office. Rich men always have to pay their ex-wives. It's almost automatic. You'll be set for life. But David wasn't sitting around doing nothing. He was gathering evidence like a detective solving a crime. He interviewed every servant in the house. Maria, the cook, told him about the times Victoria had thrown away Mrs. Grace's meals. She would make me prepare beautiful food for you and her, Maria said sadly. But then she would give your poor mother moldy bread and cold soup. James, the gardener, remembered hearing Victoria screaming at Mrs. Grace through the open windows. It broke my heart, sir, he said. That sweet old lady didn't deserve such treatment. Even Mrs. Johnson from next door came forward. I heard that woman yelling almost every day, she told David. Your mother used to call me crying, but she made me promise not to tell you. She didn't want to cause trouble. But the most powerful evidence came from the security cameras. David spent hours watching the recordings, and what he saw made him furious all over again. There was Victoria slapping Mrs. Grace's hand away from the fruit bowl. There she was, forcing his mother to eat scraps while she enjoyed fresh meals. There she was screaming and throwing plates while Mrs. Grace cowered in fear. David saved every single video. He made copies and gave them to his lawyer, a smart woman who had been fighting for justice for 20 years. This is more than enough, his lawyer told him. No judge in the world will give that woman a penny after seeing these videos. Meanwhile, Victoria was getting more and more worried. Her fancy lawyer started asking for money up front. Cases like this can be complicated, he said nervously after David's lawyer showed him some of the evidence. Victoria's friends began treating her differently too. Word travels fast in their wealthy neighborhood. Soon everyone knew about the cruel way she had treated Mrs. Grace. I can't believe you would hurt that sweet old woman, said Linda, who used to be Victoria's closest friend. Don't call me anymore. One by one, Victoria found herself alone. No friends returned her calls. No invitations came in the mail. Even her own family was ashamed of her behavior. But Victoria was too proud and too greedy to give up. She was convinced that she would win in court and become rich from David's money. Just wait, she told herself as she sat alone in the small apartment she had rented. Just wait until that judge sees what a poor, mistreated wife I am. The court date was set for a Thursday morning in October. Victoria spent her last money on a new red dress and had her hair done at the most expensive salon in town. I'm going to destroy him, she told her reflection in the mirror. I'm going to take everything he has. But as she walked into that courtroom, Victoria Sterling had no idea that she was walking into her own downfall. The judge, the jury, the witnesses, and the truth were all waiting for her. And justice was about to be served. Go be continued. F0LW for more.